This wasn't volatility, it was forced delivery under pressure. In the next few minutes, I'll show you three things: what changed inside the silver market, why it changed without public warning, and what that change now forces next across the system. What most people saw were routine price movements and familiar commentary about metals trading sideways. What actually mattered happened beneath that surface, in the mechanics of settlement and enforcement. Headlines focused on price stability and macro noise. The private move was about delivery obligation. That detail changes the interpretation. Large institutions that normally roll exposure forward were pushed into a corner where rolling was no longer available on acceptable terms. The lever here wasn't a dramatic announcement or a public rule rewrite. It was an enforcement shift inside the settlement process that quietly tightened how paper claims could be resolved. Futures contracts that once functioned as flexible exposure tools began behaving like binding claims on metal. The mechanism is simple but unforgiving. When delivery ratios rise while registered inventory falls, optionality disappears. The system stops asking what participants prefer and starts enforcing what balances. This is not sentiment, it's accounting with teeth. First, delivery requests began clustering instead of dispersing, meaning more contracts stood simultaneously. Then, counterparties that usually absorbed rolls demanded higher concessions or stepped back entirely, but that's not the real pressure point. Next, clearing conditions adjusted in subtle ways, increasing the cost of deferral without announcing a crisis. Then, inventory thresholds that rarely mattered started to matter operationally. Here's where the incentives show up. After that, short-side exposure became time-bound rather than flexible, forcing decisions instead of postponements. And that's the hinge point. From there, delivery wasn't chosen. It was triggered. The public story framed this as routine settlement noise. The private reality was constraint. Who benefits from that shift? Entities holding physical inventory and those positioned for enforced resolution. Who gets boxed in? Participants dependent on perpetual rolling and cheap deferral. What gets hidden? The fact that price remained calm while access tightened. This is where second-order effects begin. If delivery enforcement persists, then paper liquidity becomes conditional rather than assumed. If inventory buffers continue shrinking, then margin and settlement terms harden further. If those two happen together, then price stops being the leading signal and becomes a lagging summary. That breaks the old playbook. For anyone holding cash, the implication is not immediate loss, but delayed repricing, where stability masks pressure. For those holding risk assets, correlation assumptions weaken as settlement mechanics override macro narratives. For those relying on a paycheck, the effect is indirect but real, as financial tightening travels through credit conditions rather than headlines. The mistake here is chasing visible moves while ignoring structural ones. Don't chase price spikes that arrive late. Track delivery ratios and inventory behavior weekly, not commentary. Assume price lags reality when enforcement tightens. Treat settlement behavior as the signal, not the headline. Keep optionality when systems lose flexibility. This transition didn't require panic because it relied on incentives. Closed-room decisions adjusted how rules were applied, not what rules existed. Once that happens, behavior changes quietly and sticks. The unanswered file now is simple and unresolved. How long can delivery enforcement continue before it rewrites participation entirely? When that answer arrives, it won't arrive loudly. The system already moved. What follows from that hinge point is not a single dramatic event, but a chain reaction that unfolds through incentives rather than announcements. Once delivery becomes enforced rather than optional, every participant begins to recalculate risk in real time. The system stops behaving like a market built on expectations and starts behaving like a mechanism governed by limits. That distinction matters because limits do not negotiate, they only tighten. What had been treated as theoretical exposure becomes operational obligation, and the difference between those two states is where stress accumulates fastest. The first consequence shows up in participation. When rolling contracts forward becomes expensive or uncertain, fewer players are willing to initiate new paper positions. Not because demand disappears, but because flexibility does. Liquidity thins quietly, spreads widen slightly at first, almost imperceptibly. But that's not the real pressure point. The real pressure emerges when fewer participants are willing to intermediate risk, which concentrates exposure among those who remain. That concentration increases sensitivity to every incremental change in inventory or settlement terms. The second consequence appears in timing. Markets built on confidence assume time is neutral. Positions can be adjusted tomorrow, next week, or next month with minimal penalty. Once delivery enforcement tightens, time becomes directional. Waiting is no longer free. Each settlement window carries consequence. That changes behavior quickly. Participants shorten horizons. Decisions that were once deferred are pulled forward. Here's where the incentives show up. When time itself becomes a cost, optionality is consumed faster than expected. The third consequence is informational. Price no longer tells the full story because price reflects cleared trades, not constrained ones. What matters shifts to flow. Who is demanding delivery, who is stepping back from writing exposure, and which inventories are being protected rather than offered. These signals are quiet and technical, which is why they're often ignored. But they are decisive. Systems rarely fail because participants lack information. They fail because the wrong information is watched. At this stage, enforcement doesn't need to escalate to change outcomes. The mere persistence of constraint is enough. If delivery enforcement remains steady, then behavior adapts permanently. If behavior adapts permanently, then the market's internal logic rewrites itself without any official reset. That is how rule changes actually work in practice. They are absorbed through incentives, not announcements. For institutions, this creates a fork. Those with access to physical inventory gain leverage not through price, but through certainty. Those without inventory are forced to operate defensively, prioritizing risk reduction over return. That shift ripples outward. Risk models are adjusted, capital allocation tightens, exposure that once looked efficient now looks fragile. None of this requires fear. It requires arithmetic. For individuals watching from the outside, this phase is deceptive. Everything appears normal enough. Prices move within familiar ranges. Commentators debate macro factors. But beneath that surface, the system is operating under a different set of assumptions. The mistake is assuming visibility equals transparency. In reality, the most important changes are happening where few people look: settlement behavior, inventory classifications, and the willingness of intermediaries to stand in the middle. If delivery enforcement persists, then paper liquidity becomes conditional. If paper liquidity becomes conditional, then volatility is suppressed until it isn't. That is the pattern markets repeat. Pressure accumulates off-screen while prices appear stable because stability itself becomes a management tool. When release finally happens, it looks sudden only to those who weren't tracking the constraints. This is why the distinction between exposure and access matters so much. Exposure can be priced, access cannot. Once access becomes the binding constraint, valuation models lose authority. Participants stop asking what something is worth and start asking whether it can be obtained at all, on time, and on agreed terms. That shift is subtle, but once it happens, it doesn't reverse easily. For cash holders, this environment rewards patience over prediction. Stability can persist longer than expected, but it is no longer neutral. For holders of risk assets, correlations that once held begin to fray as settlement mechanics override macro narratives. For wage earners, the effect arrives indirectly, through tighter credit conditions and slower transmission rather than sudden shocks. The critical mistake in this phase is overreacting to visible moves while underreacting to structural ones. Price spikes draw attention. Structural tightening does not. But structural tightening is what determines the range of future outcomes. When delivery enforcement becomes normalized, the system's tolerance for leverage drops permanently, even if prices recover. This is not about calling an endpoint. It's about recognizing a regime change. Once a market shifts from flexibility to enforcement, the old assumptions no longer apply. Strategies built on abundance fail quietly. Those built on optionality survive longer. The unanswered question now isn't whether enforcement exists. It's how long it persists before participants fully reprice behavior around it. That answer will not arrive as news. It will arrive as absence. Fewer offers, tighter terms, and a market that looks calm while operating under strain. What ultimately defines this phase is not speed, but direction. Once a system begins moving from flexibility toward enforcement, it rarely snaps back to where it was. It settles into a narrower corridor of acceptable behavior. Participants learn where the walls are by touching them. Every interaction reinforces the same lesson. Optionality is no longer assumed. It must be earned, priced, or avoided altogether. Over time, this reshapes expectations. What once felt temporary starts to feel structural. Institutions stop planning around best-case liquidity and start planning around constrained access. That shift is subtle, but it is decisive. It changes how much risk is tolerated, how far positions are extended, and how aggressively leverage is used. Even when prices stabilize, the memory of constraint remains embedded in decision-making. This is where many observers misread calm as resolution. Quiet markets are often interpreted as healthy markets. In reality, quiet can mean participation has narrowed. Fewer actors, smaller margins for error, and tighter internal limits produce stability on the surface, while fragility increases underneath. The system looks orderly because it is cautious, not because it is strong. When enforcement becomes part of the background, the market's internal conversation changes. Discussions shift away from upside potential and toward downside containment. Meetings focus on settlement risk rather than return profiles. Capital is allocated with an emphasis on survivability. These are not emotional responses. They are rational adaptations to a system that has revealed its constraints. For those waiting for a clear signal that everything has changed, that moment rarely comes. There is no bell, No official acknowledgement. The shift announces itself through behavior, fewer aggressive trades, more conservative positioning, and a growing preference for certainty over efficiency. By the time this behavior becomes obvious, it is already entrenched. This is why the most important developments often go unnoticed by those watching headlines alone. Structural change does not compete for attention. It accumulates quietly. Each small adjustment reinforces the next, until the market is operating under a new logic that feels normal simply because it has been lived in long enough. At that point, the question is no longer whether the old framework will return. It is whether participants have fully adapted to the new one. Some will. Others will continue operating as if flexibility still exists, learning only when they encounter resistance. Markets tend to be unforgiving to those who cling to outdated assumptions. The final implication is this: once enforcement replaces discretion, reversals require more than reassurance. They require proof that inventories have rebuilt, proof that settlement pressure has eased, proof that optionality has returned in practice, not just in theory. Until that proof exists consistently, behavior will remain defensive, even if prices suggest otherwise. This is not pessimism, it is realism. Systems governed by limits behave differently from systems governed by confidence. Understanding which one you are in matters more than predicting the next move. The former demands caution and flexibility. The latter rewards speed and conviction. Confusing the two is where most errors occur. As this phase matures, the market will continue to function. Trades will clear, prices will update. From the outside, little will appear broken. But internally, the operating assumptions have shifted. The system is no longer optimized for expansion. It is optimized for control. That is the defining characteristic of this moment. Not collapse, not chaos. Control through constraint. When you recognize that, the noise fades and the signal becomes clearer. The real story is not what prices are doing today, but what the system is allowing participants to do tomorrow. And once a market teaches its participants that access is conditional and enforcement is real, that lesson is not unlearned easily. It becomes part of the environment, part of the risk, part of every decision that follows. That is where things now stand. The move has already happened. The adjustment is ongoing, and the outcome will be shaped not by headlines, but by how long constraint remains the governing force.